Welcome to Horrified Stories, where fear comes to life. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more spine-chilling tales. Let's start our today's story, Nightshade's Echo. The town of Ravenwood was the sort of place where nothing much ever happened. Nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains, surrounded by miles of dense, whispering pine forests, it seemed like a haven for those seeking solitude or hiding from the world. The locals believed their town was unremarkable, save for one peculiar feature: the strange echoes that could sometimes be heard at night. "It's just the wind in the trees," people would say when the eerie sounds drifted through the forest. A low, mournful hum that seemed to carry with it an ancient sadness. But even the most practical townsfolk never lingered too long outside after dark. For 16-year-old Clara Voss, Ravenwood was both a refuge and a prison. After her mother's sudden death, her father, Alan Voss, had moved them from the bustle of city life to this isolated town. He insisted it was for a fresh start, but Clara suspected it had more to do with his inability to face the memories of her mother and their old home. As the weeks turned to months, Clara found herself drawn to the woods more and more. There was something about the towering pines and the thick, earthy scent of moss and fallen leaves that felt comforting until the echoes started calling her name. The Voss family arrived in Ravenwood at the beginning of autumn. The air was crisp, carrying the faint smell of pine resin and wood smoke, and the streets were lined with fading yellow and orange leaves. Their new home, a two-story colonial house at the edge of the forest, was charming in a rustic sort of way. The real estate agent had called it historic, but to Clara, it just looked old and slightly decrepit. "I think it's got character," Ellen said, forcing a smile as he unloaded boxes from the moving truck. "It's got termites," Clara muttered under her breath. She leaned against the doorframe, staring out at the forest that loomed behind the house. The trees seemed unnaturally still, their dark trunks like silent sentinels. "You like it here," her father said, though his voice lacked conviction. Clara didn't respond. She didn't have the energy to argue, not after the long drive and the lingering ache of her mother's absence. That night, as she lay in her new bedroom, the silence of Ravenwood pressed against her like a weight. She wasn't used to such stillness. The city had been alive with noise, cars, voices, sirens. Here, the only sound was the occasional rustle of leaves and the faint creak of the house settling. But just as she began to drift off, she heard it, a low, distant hum, like someone murmuring just beyond her window. Clara sat up, her heart racing. She listened intently, but the sound was gone. "Probably just the wind," she whispered to herself, but deep down, she wasn't so sure. The next morning, Clara decided to explore the forest. She told herself it was just to kill time, but in truth, she was curious. There was something about the woods that both intrigued and unnerved her, like they were hiding a secret just beneath their surface. The trees were massive, their gnarled roots twisting across the forest floor like veins. The air was cool and damp, and sunlight filtered through the canopy in thin, golden beams. Clara followed a narrow dirt path, her boots crunching on fallen leaves. As she ventured deeper, she began to notice strange markings on some of the trees, symbols carved into the bark: circles, triangles, and lines that looked almost like runes. She reached out to trace one of the carvings with her fingers. "What are you doing out here?" The voice startled her, and she spun around to see a boy about her age standing a few feet away. He was tall and lanky, with messy black hair and a wary expression. "Sorry," Clara said, taking a step back. "I didn't mean to trespass or anything." "You're not trespassing," the boy said, "but you shouldn't be here. People don't come into the forest alone." Clara raised an eyebrow. "Why not?" The boy hesitated, glancing over his shoulder as if checking for something. "Just stay on the main paths." "Okay, and don't come out here after dark." Before she could ask him anything else, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees. That night, Clara couldn't stop thinking about the boy's warning. What was so dangerous about the forest? She had tried asking her father during dinner, but he had just shrugged and muttered something about small-town superstitions. As the hours passed and the house grew quiet, Clara found herself wide awake, staring at the ceiling. Then she heard it again, low hum, drifting through her open window. Her pulse quickened as she got out of bed and crept to the window. The sound was faint but unmistakable, a rhythmic, melodic whisper that seemed to come from the direction of the forest. Clara's hand tightened around the windowsill. "Hello," she called out softly. The hum stopped. She waited, her breath held, but the silence stretched on. Feeling foolish, she closed the window and climbed back into bed. But as she lay there, trying to convince herself it was just her imagination. The whispers returned. This time, they were clearer. Clara, her blood turned to ice. The next day, Clara decided to visit the library. If there was something strange about the forest, surely someone had written about it. The Ravenwood Public Library was a small, cozy building that smelled of old paper and dust. Clara approached the librarian, an elderly woman with sharp eyes and a warm smile. "Aye," Clara said. "Do you have any books about the forest?" The librarian frowned. "What kind of books?" History, folklore, anything about weird stuff happening there." The woman's smile faltered, and for a moment, she looked almost nervous. "The forest has always been a part of Ravenwood," she said carefully, "but I wouldn't put too much stock in old ghost stories." "Ghost stories?" Clara pressed. The librarian sighed. "There's a local legend about the Nightshade family. They were one of the first families to settle here, back in the 1800s. According to the story, they practiced strange rituals in the woods. People said they could summon spirits, talk to the dead, but they all disappeared one night, every single one of them. No one knows what happened." Clara felt a chill run down her spine. "And the echoes?" The librarian gave her a sharp look. "It's just the wind," she said firmly. But Clara wasn't convinced. That evening, Clara returned to the forest, this time with a flashlight and a notebook. She was determined to find answers, even if it meant breaking the boy's warning about staying out after dark. The forest was eerily quiet as she ventured off the main path, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The runes on the trees seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, and the air grew colder with every step. Then she heard it again hum. It was louder now, more insistent, and it seemed to be coming from deeper within the woods. She followed it, her heart pounding, until she came to a small clearing. In the center of the clearing was a stone altar, weathered and covered in moss. Strange symbols were carved into its surface, and around it lay a circle of unlit candles. As she stepped closer, she felt the air shift, growing heavier. The hum grew louder, rising to a wailing crescendo that filled her ears and made her head throb. Then she saw Ida's shadow, tall and thin, moving between the trees. Its form was indistinct, shifting and flickering like smoke. Clara frowned, her breath caught in her throat. The shadow turned, and though it had no face, she felt its gaze bore into her. And then, in a voice like the rustling of dead leaves, it spoke. "You shouldn't have come here." The shadow's warning stayed with Clara long after she fled the forest. Even as she stumbled home, panting and clutching her flashlight like a lifeline, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd crossed a line she couldn't uncross. Something had seen her, something that wasn't human. The whispers in the forest weren't the wind, and the echoes that carried her name weren't figments of her imagination. Ravenwood held secrets older than its pines, and Clara had taken her first steps into their depths. The question was whether she could ever step back out. Clara didn't tell her father about what had happened in the woods. She knew he wouldn't believe her, and even if he did, he would probably just forbid her from going back. Instead, she locked her bedroom door, sat her on her bed, and tried to steady her trembling hands. In the dim glow of her desk lamp, she pulled her notebook from her backpack and flipped to the pages where she had scrawled notes about the runes she'd seen. As her pencil traced the lines she had copied, she noticed a strange sensation. Her skin tingled, like static electricity. Her eyes drifted to her left palm, where an ache had been growing since she touched the altar in the clearing. Faintly etched into her skin was a mark, a tiny spiral, similar to one of the runes she'd seen carved into the trees. Clara's stomach twisted. She scrubbed at the mark with her sleeve, then ran to the bathroom to wash her hands. The spiral wouldn't fade. It wasn't dirt or ink. It was something else, something deeper. It was a warning. The next day, Clara went back to the library. This time, she didn't approach the librarian. She wanted to dig into the town's history herself. The archives were in the basement, a small, windowless room filled with dusty filing cabinets and stacks of old newspapers. Clara spent hours combing through the records, piecing together fragments of Ravenwood's past. It didn't take long to notice a pattern. The Nightshade family had vanished in 1882, but their disappearance wasn't the only strange occurrence in Ravenwood's history. Every few decades, there were reports of strange sounds in the forest, sightings of shadowy figures, and unexplained disappearances. In 1927, 3 children went missing near the edge of the woods. In 1965, a hunter claimed he saw something inhuman lurking among the trees. And in 1993, a local woman named Evelyn Parrish disappeared while hiking. Each time, The whispers grew louder in the weeks leading up to the event, and the townsfolk whispered of the echoes. Clara found herself drawn to one article in particular, an interview with an elderly man named Jeremiah Harker, published in 1994. "There's a reason we don't linger in the woods," Harker had said. "The Nightshades open a door that was meant to stay closed, and it's never been properly shut. The echoes you hear, they're not just sounds, they're the voices of the ones they let through." Clara's hand tightened on the newspaper. Clara hadn't seen the boy who had warned her since their brief encounter in the woods, but she was determined to find him. He knew something important. She waited until school let out, then wandered through the streets of Ravenwood, asking about him. Her classmates gave her puzzled looks, but finally, someone pointed her toward the edge of town, where a small house Saturday surrounded by tall grass and wildflowers. The boy was outside, sitting on the porch with a book in his lap. He looked up as she approached, his expression wary. "You shouldn't be here," he said, standing up. "I need to know what's going on," Clara said, stepping closer. "The echoes, the shadows, you know something, don't you?" The boy sighed, running a hand through his messy hair. "I was hoping you'd just forget about it, but you went back, didn't you?" Clara nodded. He hesitated, then gestured for her to sit on the porch steps. "My name's Elias," he said, "and if you really want to know, I'll tell you, but you're not going to like it." Elias told her about the Nightshade family, their obsession with the forest, their fascination with the supernatural, and their belief that the echoes were the voices of an ancient force that could grant power to those who summoned it. "They use the altar you found," Elias said. "It's a focal point for something. I don't know what it is exactly, but it's not natural." "What happened to them?" Clara asked. "No one knows for sure," Elias said, "but the story goes that they tried to complete a ritual, something big, something final. They thought they could control the echoes, but whatever they called up, it didn't let them leave." Clara shivered. "And the mark, the spiral," she held up her palm. Elias' eyes widened. "You touched the altar." "I didn't. No, that's bad, Clara, really bad. The mark means it's noticed you." "What's it?" Elias shook his head. "I don't know what it is, but it doesn't stop once it's chosen someone." That night, Clara stayed up late, poring over her notes and the articles she had found in the library. She felt like she was piecing together a puzzle, but half the pieces were missing. As the clock struck midnight, she heard the whispers again. This time, they weren't faint or distant. They were clear, like someone was standing right outside her window. Clara, her chest tightened. She grabbed her flashlight and crept to the window. The backyard was empty, the forest looming dark and silent beyond it. "Clara," the voice came again, closer now, and her flashlight flickered. She turned toward her bedroom door and frowned. A shadow was standing in the hallway. It wasn't human. It was tall and impossibly thin, its body flickering like smoke, and though it had no eyes, Clara felt its gaze pierce her. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices overlapping and echoing in her mind. She clutched her head, trying to block them out, but they were everywhere. "Leave me alone," she screamed. The shadow lunged forward, and the light in her room went out. When Clara woke up, she was lying on the floor, her flashlight broken beside her. Her father found her the next morning, pale and trembling, and demanded to know what had happened. "I fell," she lied, but she knew the truth. The shadow had marked her, just as the altar had. Desperate for answers, she sought out Elias again. "You can't run from it," he told her. "Once it's noticed you, it's only a matter of time. The echoes don't just kill, they claim." "Is there any way to stop it?" Clara asked. Elias hesitated. "There's one way, the same way the Nightshades tried." "You mean the ritual?" He nodded. "But it's dangerous. If you do it wrong, you'll end up like them, or worse." Clara clenched her fists. She didn't have a choice. Whatever the echoes were, they weren't going to let her go. "I'll do it," she said. Elias gave her a long, searching look. "Then we'll need to go back to the altar, and we'll need to move fast." There was no turning back now. The mark on Clara's palm burned like a warning, as if it knew what she was planning. The whispers in the forest were louder than ever, relentless in their pursuit, and the shadow, whatever it was, had stopped lingering at the edges of her vision. It was everywhere now, haunting her dreams, watching her from the corners of the house, moving closer with every passing day. The Nightshade family had tried to seal the door they had opened, and they had failed. If Clara wanted to survive, she would have to finish what they started. But as Elias had warned her, the ritual would require more than courage. It would demand a sacrifice. Elias handed Clara an old leather-bound journal. its pages filled with spidery handwriting. The edges were yellowed, the ink faded in places, but the symbols inside were unmistakable. This belonged to the Nightshades, he said. I found it hidden in the attic of my house years ago. My mom used to tell me not to go poking around in their business, but I had to know. I think they wrote this when they were trying to stop whatever they had let out. Clara flipped through the pages, her fingers trembling. The journal was a chaotic mix of notes, diagrams, and warnings. The Nightshades had been meticulous in their research, but even their confidence hadn't saved them. The ritual, Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. What does it do? It's supposed to close the door, Elias said, the one between here and wherever the echoes are coming from. But to do that, you need to bind the echoes to something or someone. Clara's blood ran cold. Bind them? What does that mean? Elias hesitated. It means someone has to act as a tether. They have to take the echoes into themselves. That's how the door gets sealed. And then what? Then they don't come back. Clara stared at the journal, her heart pounding. She didn't ask what happened to the person who became the tether. She was afraid she already knew the answer. The ritual required 3 things: an object of power, a vessel, and a place where the door was thinnest. The altar in the clearing is where the Nightshades perform their rituals. Elias said, it's the thinnest point. That's where it has to happen. What about the object of power? Clara asked. Elias handed her a small pendant on a black cord. The stone at its center was dark and smooth, like polished obsidian, and it hummed faintly in her hand. This belonged to my great-grandmother, he said. She was one of the last people to see the Nightshades alive. Some people in town think she was a witch, but I think she just understood the forest better than anyone else. Clara slipped the pendant around her neck. The hum grew stronger, resonating with the mark on her palm. What about the vessel? She asked. Elias didn't answer. The sun was setting as Clara and Elias made their way into the forest. The air was heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the trees seemed to press closer the deeper they went. The whispers started almost immediately. Clara turned back. It's too late. She gritted her teeth, refusing to look over her shoulder. She knew there was nothing there, but the voices made her skin crawl. Elias led the way, holding a lantern that cast flickering shadows on the trees. The journal was tucked under his arm, and every so often, he would glance back at Clara, as if making sure she was still there. Finally, they reached the clearing. The altar stood in the center, just as Clara remembered it. The runes carved into its surface seemed to glow faintly in the twilight, and the air around it felt charged, like the moments before a thunderstorm. This is it, Elias said, setting the lantern down. Once we start, there's no stopping. You understand that, right? Clara nodded. What do I have to do? Elias opened the journal and flipped to a page near the back. You'll need to stand on the altar, hold the pendant, and repeat the incantation I give you. I'll handle the rest. What about the tether? Elias hesitated, then looked her in the eye. I'll be the tether. What? Clara's voice rose. No, you can't. I don't have a choice. Elias said, the mark chose you, which means you're the one who can close the door. But the echoes need someone to hold them. If it's not me, it'll be you. Clara felt her chest tighten. There has to be another way. There isn't. Elias' voice was firm. This is the only way to stop it. As the last rays of sunlight faded, Elias lit the candles around the altar. Their flames danced in the growing darkness, casting long, flickering shadows across the clearing. Clara climbed onto the altar, clutching the pendant in her hand. The mark on her palm burned fiercely now, as if it was reacting to the energy around her. Elias began to chant, his voice low and steady. The words were in a language Clara didn't recognize, but they sent a shiver down her spine. The whispers grew louder, overlapping and blending into a cacophony that made her head throb. The shadows around the clearing began to move, twisting and shifting as if they were alive. Clara, Elias called out. Now. She lifted the pendant and began to recite the incantation he had given her. The words felt strange in her mouth, but she forced herself to keep going, her voice rising over the din of the whispers. The air grew colder, and the shadows converged on the altar, swirling around her like a vortex. Her vision blurred, and for a moment, she thought she saw faces in the darkness, faces that were watching her, judging her. And, with a deafening roar, the ground beneath her trembled. The shadows surged toward Elias, enveloping him in a writhing mass of darkness. He cried out, his voice raw with pain, but it didn't stop chanting. Elias, Clara screamed. Keep going, he shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the wind. Clara gripped the pendant tighter and repeated the final line of the incantation. The shadows recoiled, as if struggling against an unseen force. But they couldn't escape. They clung to Elias, seeping into his skin, his eyes, his mouth. For a moment, the clearing was silent. Then Elias collapsed. Clara jumped down from the altar and ran to his side. His skin was pale, his breathing shallow, but his eyes fluttered open. "It's done," he whispered. The forest was still, the whispers gone, but as Clara helped Elias to his feet, she noticed something in his expression, something dark and distant, like a shadow that refused to let go. The days that followed were eerily quiet. The mark on Clara's palm faded, and the whispers in the forest were gone. For the first time in weeks, Ravenwood felt normal. But Elias wasn't the same. He was distant, his once warm demeanor replaced by a cold, detached calm. He assured Clara that he was fine, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the echoes hadn't truly been silenced. One night, as she lay in bed, Clara heard a sound, a faint hum, barely audible. She sat up, her heart racing, but the sound wasn't coming from the forest. It was coming from her dreams. The forest was quiet, the echoes had vanished, leaving Ravenwood in a strange, uneasy calm, but Clara knew it wasn't over. The mark on her palm had faded, but she could still feel the phantom burn when she touched the pendant. And Elias, whatever had happened to him during the ritual, wasn't himself. His smile was gone, replaced by an unsettling stillness that left Clara wondering if she had truly saved him or doomed him. The whispers may have stopped, but their weight still lingered. Something wasn't right, and Clara was determined to find out what. But some doors, once opened, cannot be closed without consequences. It started with the dreams. Every night, Clara found herself back in the clearing, standing in front of the altar. The forest stretched around her, dark and endless. But the whispers weren't there. Instead, she heard something else, a low hum, like a pulse reverberating through the earth. She would wake up drenched in sweat, the hum still echoing in her ears. It wasn't long before the dreams began to bleed into her waking life. Shadows flickered in her peripheral vision, disappearing when she turned her head. Objects in her room moved when she wasn't looking, and the pendant around her neck seemed heavier than before, its surface faintly warm to the touch. When she told Elias about it, his response was cryptic. "That door isn't fully closed," he said. "What do you mean?" Clara demanded. "We did the ritual. The echoes are gone." "They're not gone," Elias said. His voice was hollow, distant. "They're trapped, but a cage can only hold for so long." Clara stared at him, her chest tightening. "What are you saying?" Elias looked at her, his eyes shadowed and unreadable. "I'm saying we're running out of time." Clara returned to the library, desperate for answers. The Nightshade family journal had mentioned the ritual, but it had also hinted at something more, a deeper truth about the echoes and the force they were connected to. In the town archives, she found a collection of letters written by Margaret Nightshade, the matriarch of the family. Most of the letters were mundane, detailing household matters and correspondence with neighbors. But one caught Clara's attention. It was addressed to someone named Alistair Crowe and dated a week before the Nightshade's disappearance. "The door has grown too wide, and the echoes are no longer content to remain on the other side. They hunger, Alistair, they hunger for a vessel, and I fear they will not stop until they are fed. We thought we could control them, but we were wrong. The only way to contain them now is to make the ultimate sacrifice. I pray you forgive us for what we must do." Clara's hands trembled as she read the words. The echoes weren't just voices. They were hallucination, malevolent, and endlessly hungry. She had to warn Elias. When Clara found Elias, he was sitting on the porch of his house, staring out at the forest. "I found something," she said, holding out the letter. Elias took it and read it silently. When he finished, he set it down beside him and sighed. "I already knew," he said. "What?" Clara frowned. "You knew about this?" "I've known since before we did the ritual," Elias admitted. "The journal made it clear that the echoes can't be destroyed. They can only be contained. And the container," he paused, looking down at his hands, "is me." Clara's stomach dropped. "What are you talking about?" "They're inside me, Clara," Elias said, his voice breaking. "I can feel them. They're trying to break free, but as long as I'm alive, they can't." Clara's breath caught in her throat. "That's why the Nightshades disappeared. They sacrificed themselves to keep the echoes contained." Elias nodded. "And now it's my turn." Clara refused to accept it. There had to be another way. She wouldn't let Elias sacrifice himself after everything they'd been through. Desperate, she turned to the forest for answers. The whispers had stopped, but the energy in Ravenwood's woods was still palpable, humming just beneath the surface. Clara returned to the altar, the pendant clutched tightly in her hand, and called out into the silence. "I know you're still here," she said. "Show yourself." For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the shadows shifted, and a figure emerged from the darkness. It was the same shadow she had seen in her house, tall, flickering entity with no discernible features. "You carry the mark," the shadow said, its voice a low rumble. "Why have you summoned me?" "I need to know how to stop you," Clara said, her voice trembling. The shadow tilted its head. "Stop us." "I won't let you take Elias," Clara said. "There has to be another way." The shadow laughed, a sound like rustling leaves and breaking glass. "There is no other way. We are eternal, and we hunger. The boy is merely a vessel. When he is gone, we will find another." Clara's heart pounded. "What if I became the vessel?" The shadow hesitated. "You would take his place." "Yes," Clara said, her voice firm. "If it means stopping you, I'll do it." The shadow loomed closer. "Very well, but know this, once you take the echoes into yourself, there is no escape. You will be bound to us, body and soul, for all eternity." Clara swallowed hard. "I'll do whatever it takes." When Clara told Elias about her plan, he was furious. "You can't do this," he said, grabbing her shoulders. "You don't know what you're getting into." "I know enough," Clara said, "and I'm not going to let you die for this." "Clara, no," she shouted. "You've done enough. Elias, it's my turn." Elias stared at her, his eyes filled with desperation. "If you do this, you'll be giving up everything." "I already have," Clara said softly. They returned to the clearing together. The altar was cold beneath Clara's hands as she climbed onto it one last time. The pendant around her neck glowed faintly, resonating with the energy of the forest. Elias read the incantation from the journal, his voice shaking. The shadows gathered around them, and the air grew heavy with the weight of the echoes. As the final words of the incantation left Elias' lips, the shadows surged toward Clara. She clenched the pendant tightly, bracing herself for the pain. It was like being torn apart and stitched back together all at once. The whispers filled her mind, their voices clamoring for attention, but she forced herself to stay focused. When the shadows finally settled, Clara opened her eyes. The clearing was silent, the echoes were gone. But Clara wasn't the same. Clara left Ravenwood a week later. She couldn't stay in it with the echoes inside her. Elias tried to convince her to stay, but she knew it was too dangerous. The shadows were quiet for now, but she could feel them stirring beneath the surface, waiting for their chance to break free. As she walked away from the town, the forest loomed behind her, dark and silent. For now, the door was closed, but deep within the echoes, a new whisper began, and it carried Clara's name. If you like this story, don't forget to hit the like button, share and subscribe the channel. Help us grow. Thanks for watching.